So, welcome. Additions. My name is David Charbonneau, and I'm your host for today. I lead the development of open teams at Quansight, and we have a great show lined up for you. We're going to be talking about the open source project Intake. Let me introduce my co-host first, Tony Fast. Tony?
Hi, everyone. My name's Tony Fast. I work as a data scientist and open source consultant at Quansight, and I moonlight as a PyData and Jupyter community organizer down in Atlanta, Georgia. Let me continue by welcoming Martin and thanking him for being on our show. Hi, Martin.
Hello.
Hey, Martin.
I'm Martin Durant. I'm an open source developer at Anaconda, which of course is a good friend of Quansight. I work on Dask, is something that people might be interested in, and of course Intake that I'll talk about today. And I've also worked on other data format and storage backend things. I live in Toronto and I work from home, which is what you can see behind me.
Well, let's go ahead and have a bit of a brief introduction and make ourselves a little bit more personal. One of the things we do every week, sometimes we talk about headlines that have caught our eye or things that are interesting us this week. Why don't you go ahead first, Martin, and tell us about your news highlight of the week?
I don't have a news highlight as such, but I did go to PyData in New York last week. And aside from it being the first time that Intake was officially presented to the public in a live setting, I did see the talk by Travis, who is the Quansight head, talking about how can you actually make a business and money out of open source, which is very interesting. And even though this was not strictly a science conference as such, so it was mostly about tools rather than applications, I did see a talk about installing smart electricity meters into houses and what effect it has on people's behavior, which is not very much, but from the point of view of the monitoring ability that gives the company so that you can start making smart decisions about how you distribute your energy to those people, which is perhaps more significant.
I can imagine I might walk by the monitor and say, yep, spending about as much as I figured. I think like Martin, I don't, unless the archive is your headline news. My headline for this week was there was a really interesting thesis that was posted about the application of topological data analysis to natural language processing. So they were kind of relating TDA and simplicial complexes to word vectors, which is kind of interesting. And the results were intriguing in that they could differentiate the fact that words were homonyms just based on the simplicial complexes that emerged from how they were analyzing the things. But it's kind of an early attempt at taking a topological approach to the problem of natural language recognition. So I found that pretty exciting and interesting.
That sounds really cool. So for my update, I'm actually going to stay recent. In fact, so recent as I guess this came out either yesterday or this morning. But congratulations to Bokeh on reaching version 1.0. They were guest number 1 on open source directions. And it's awesome to hear after all these years that Bokeh is finally 1.0. It's touting itself as the shiny for Python. And now you can connect Python and JavaScript very easily. You can connect to other PyData tools. And you can also use Bokeh with streaming and array data with full support for Jupyter Notebooks and Jupyter Lab. So it sounds like there's some awesome milestones that have been hit, and everybody should try and upgrade and use the newest Bokeh.
That is awesome. That's wonderful news. Well, Martin, let's go ahead and move on to talking about your project, about Intake. One of the things that we noticed in doing some research early on is that you've already gotten 4,000 downloads on anaconda.org, and it's still early days.
I just checked, and it's 4,100 as of this moment.
Awesome. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so this has been around as an idea within Anaconda since roughly the new year. The idea to make it existed previously and some design was already in place, but we put a small team together and have been working on it since January. And it wasn't released or spoken about at all until roughly the middle of August. We put out a blog at that point saying that people could try intake, but it's only now that we're viewing it as ready for wide adoption, or at least people to go out and try it and let us know what they think. It, as you say, it's early, so lots of scope to change the direction that it heads in yet.
That's fantastic.
Well, that's exciting to hear a project kind of in its early stages. It sounds like there are a couple of people who commiserated on getting this project going. So what was kind of the motivation amongst y'all in actually starting this project?
As you'll see in the demo coming up, I hope to demonstrate that this is really a missing hole in the data flow for people programming in Python. It's a need that's out there. Even if you didn't realize before this particular webinar that you had that need, you might do very soon. It's something that getting to your data, knowing which data is which and how to access it is one of those things that costs us all a lot of time. And then on the other side, how to inform people about where data is, how to disseminate that is really an unsolved problem in the PyData ecosystem at the moment. Some of these ideas came out of that. There have been projects around like Blaze is many years old and sort of bubbled along in the background for a long time, and a project called Odo, which is all about different formats and converting them. There have been parts of the puzzle around, but no attempt to pull it all together under a single framework.
Thank you.
That sounds really interesting. So I think what I had been hoping to ask was what rough need does this fill? It sounds like it's kind of integrating some of the ideas and some of the software that's kind of been available for a while. Is that a good understanding?
Yeah, so lots of libraries out there have various ways of loading data. Pandas in particular, a very popular package for data analysis, especially amongst data scientists. It has a bunch of loading functions, but there is so much different types of data out there, and knowing what to load with which package and what set of arguments you need, where you find your particular set of data, and then critically cataloging those data sets is something that essentially doesn't exist in the Python ecosystem at the moment.
So I wanted to originally ask, what alternative projects are there out there? But what it really sounds like is that this isn't necessarily an alternative, but some kind of research into what's the best of the best and what are best practices for running compute on your data. So what projects are used or considered, or technologies are used or considered with intake?
Intake isn't really about compute, although a good friend of Dask. I've worked on Dask too, so I made sure that was the case. It's about integrating with all of the many packages out there that are capable of loading data and accessing them in a single unified API. That's the important thing here. There are lots of projects out there that do some piece of this puzzle. In particular, there are quite a few things that attempt to do some idea of a catalog. The simplest might be some database, traditional database system has a set of tables in it, and that is like a catalog. But there are various online solutions too, where you can host your data with some provider, and then it gives you a list of your data sets that you have there. Intake tries to be generic, just a thin layer over all of these different things to bring them together, give a consistent feel, framework within which you can access all of your different kinds of data.
So it really seems like intake's a lot more for the user. Y'all are really focused on the user experience when it comes to intaking your data.
It's a way for the person who's creating these data assets to be able to get them to the user without the user having to learn everything about all of the different ways in which they might access their data. So it's really about all of these different actors in the data system coming together and agreeing on a contract of how you describe data. It makes it easier for the user because they now don't have to do that research anymore. But it's also easier on the people who are putting data in place, and that they can describe the intended use of this data. They can update the prescriptions of what the data is in place. And these are all pain points that the larger the organization, the more likely it is you face them, because in a standalone single data scientist, they are probably doing all of these jobs. But if you're in a company and you have different groups, one for monitoring security and activity in your system, one for placing data assets, and then your data scientist, your data users elsewhere that just wants to get the data and not care about any of those. Intake is a way that you can get these people to agree on how to talk to each other.
That's fantastic. It sounds like there are a lot of pieces and parts and technologies that go into this project. What would you say are kind of the core technologies that comprise Intake?
To a great extent, it's its own thing, actually.
Okay.
It interacts with some of the file system specific stuff that came out of Dask. So Dask has a way of talking to particularly cloud file systems, but other storage mechanisms like S3, for example, is a very popular one. So Intake piggybacks on some of that stuff to be able to access data in different places. As I said, it's generally a good friend with Dask anyway. If you want to use Dask, then it's easy to do that with Intake, but you don't need to. So if you don't know what Dask is, don't worry about it. Much of it is specific to the particular data set that you want to load. So each data set has a particular dependency. If you have a data set that's in the ZAR format, for example, there's a pretty good chance you have no idea what that is. But if you do have that, then Intake will natively call stuff within ZAR to load that data. So Intake is always just a layer on top of whatever it is that you need that's specific to a data type.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of people who could use this or interact with this or benefit from Intake. So who are the masterminds behind all of these potential user types and designing Intake?
It came out of this general feeling at Anaconda that this was something that was ill-served, that the previous big project Blaze had attempted to tackle to some extent, but it went too deep, perhaps. So Intake is a much simpler product than that ever was. So your Travis Oliphant, who is at Quansight, was involved in all of that from the start. But we started planning it in earnest just under a year ago. Stan Sievert, who is at Anaconda, did a lot of the original planning of what Intake, of the scope of Intake and some of the original code. And then since January, it's been mostly me. At the moment, I'm the main developer on Intake. Some of the people helped out along the way. I don't think I have time to list them all at the moment.
Well, that had actually been my next question, was who maintains it, but now we know the answer. And then it's fantastic. Yeah. It's great that it's come along as fast as it has. It sounds like the ideas had a lot of time to kind of percolate and generate, so you guys were able to hit the ground running. That's wonderful.
So it's being the lone maintainer. We want to know who are you interacting with? What kind of communities and where the kind of communities do your users and contributors seem to be coming from?
That's essentially why I'm here, is to spread the word, to get people to try Intake and to give feedback. So it's new. It does a whole load of different things for a relatively small amount of code. And this question of where to go from here is a big one, an important one that we want to answer. And rather than trying to guess at what people might need, which we've done to some extent so far, we want people to get involved and say, what can Intake become? In particular, it's going to need all those bits of code that interact with the different sorts of data types that are out there, and catalogs to specific data resources that are public and available on the web. There's a certain amount of human effort that's required to pull those things together, and I hope that people get involved. So far, users, there are a relatively small number. For example, the Pangeo project, which is bringing distributed computing power to earth science and climate science. They have an intake catalog that is public and accessible and references all the various data that they use for some of their science. So that's a good start. But really, it's early stages, not too many users at the moment.
I know that there's an unserved need myself. I've had the opportunity to speak with a few enterprise customers that have specifically asked about how they should go about collecting their data and cataloging it to make it more easily available to their data science teams. So for me, it's been exciting to see this and hear about this project.
Well, if you speak to them on my behalf, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah.
Well, enough talk. It seems like we're about to actually see what intake does, huh?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I have two demos. One of these is a short presentation on what intake is about that's not in words, so that we can get through that. And then I have a quick demonstration from the user's point of view, which is only one of the several points of view. So let me... you should give me screen share.
There should be in the bottom bar a button that looks like a window. There we go.
Okay. So that disappears. So this is our tagline. And we do have an official logo now, you'll see in the top right. So you'll see that appearing in a few places. I see it was a bit late to get it onto your front slide, but that's
Sorry
fine.
about that.
So this is completely funded by Anaconda. I need to mention that is one of Anaconda's efforts to create open source software for the general good. Okay, so into the sort of semi-demo here. This is a very typical code cell that people might write when they want to access DataFrame. The purpose of this code cell is to generate a DataFrame, which is the very last line, this thing here, df. And it takes a certain amount of code to get you there. This is perhaps a slightly overblown example. You don't always have to do all of this stuff, but this is not far from typical. In this case, we have 3 files that are on some server, and we need some credentials to access them. And lots of people have written code that's like this all the time. So for the various actors that are involved in this, they all have different opinions on why this is a pain. So I'm going to run through some of the different people that are involved in the data process. First of all, there is the person who's actually going to execute this code, and they're annoyed that they have to figure out what the specific invocation is every time that the data set they're going to have to write something that's... Also, in here, it doesn't really tell you what that data is. You just hope that you pick the right thing for the right job. The files have names. That's not a very informative thing. Maybe it describes something, maybe it doesn't. And what if it got updated in the meantime? So then you have the data provider. This is the person that ensured that the files got onto the system somehow. And they actually have a new version, but the user doesn't know about that yet. So there's a broken link there that needs to be fixed. Furthermore, as things change, the actual format of the data can easily change, and even the storage medium where it's stored can be different. And all of these would mean not only do you have to update your set of file names or the URL that you're accessing, you probably have to go to much greater efforts to change your code to be able to load the data. So the data provider needs a way to get that information from them, because they know what the data is, to the user. Thirdly, there's the IT department, who would look at this and squirm in their seats, because what are you doing putting secure information directly into your notebook code? You should never do that. And what if actually you just copied and pasted this from your colleague? There is no security checks, nothing going on here. So IT would not be happy about this way of doing things at all. Again, this is in the context of some organization where you have an IT that oversees security. Maybe if you're a standalone scientist, it doesn't apply, but this is very common. And then finally, you're going to need somebody to actually write some code. What if this thing that was a CSV that already has a reader, what if it's now in Avro? Somebody needs to write that thing. Oh, and what if it's actually now stored on Azure as opposed to some bare HTTP endpoint like this? So requests exist, but can we figure out how to load that thing off Azure? Well, maybe we can, but it requires some effort. So all of these are things that Intake cares about. The Intake version of this from the user's point of view can look like this much simpler cell in which you reference a thing that is a catalog. The catalog idea is very central to the whole Intake concept. It can be as simple as a single file that's just on your system. It can be a file that's stored somewhere else. It can be an Intake server, which is a specific protocol that we've developed. You don't need to know, you just need to know what to put into this bracket. And then you access the data with a one-liner. There's more things that you can do with the data too, so I'll flip to my example to actually show you this in action. This case, I'm actually going to demonstrate something that's even more interesting and subtle, is that using Intake, you can enter a line like this, and this will work today. You can use Condor to install your data. That's something that was a big surprise to people. What does that mean? What do you mean? Condor is about installing Python libraries. Well, now with Intake, you can actually install your data. That means that it comes with all the good things of dependencies and versioning that Condor gives you. This is another option, a very useful option as it turns out. So having done that, we have Intake has a built-in catalog that we just call cat here. And US Crime, the thing that I installed, apologies, appears here as one of our built-in data sets. So we can look at it. It's this entry object that enables introspection. So we can look at what this thing is. This is before we've even loaded anything. This is just a description of the data. We see it's going to give us a data frame, and there is a basic description of what this thing is, where it came from, and there can be a lot of arbitrary information that's encoded in here. This one is pretty short. We can actually introspect the data itself. Now this is looking at some piece of the data. And you can get the kind of typical information because this is a data frame. The information that we're usually interested in is the set of columns and their data types, and here they are in front of us. And then having done that, we can even do some quick plots. You'll notice in this output above, there is this metadata which includes a plot entry, and there is a plot that's called example. We can just access that directly. This is going to read the data, and it's going to output this particular spec for a plot for us. Again, we didn't have to figure out all of these things. It just happens automatically, and there it is. This is using hvplot, which is a PyViz tool, if anybody is interested in looking that up. And it's showing us the rate of robbery and burglary since 1960. And apparently 1980-81 was a really bad time if you had stuff that could be burgled. Okay, this is the US, I believe. Yeah. I will not venture an opinion on why that might be, some socioeconomic trends, doubtless. And then finally, this was the one-liner from previously. You can actually load the data. This is now a Pandas data frame, so you can do all of the normal things that you might do with a Pandas data frame. I'd like to point out that the data frame is just one of the many possible, there's a small number of internal containers, we call them. So the outputs of a read call will be a data frame, or it will be an array, or it could be a generic sequence of objects, or it could be an Xray, which is a scientific specific thing. And those 4 things are a small number deliberately because those are the things that you actually want to use for analysis. There could maybe be some more in the future, like a fitted data machine learning model. And the final thing that I want to show here, I won't bother showing the actual pandas functionality, is that there is a data selector GUI that's available. It looks like this. It's simple and does the job. So this is the built-in catalog. Again, these are things that have been Condor installed, and we can select these, and you get basic information on the right. For each of them, you can run discover, which is going to give us some information about it. So in the case of MNIST, this is an array-like thing. We can see its shape. This is actually a whole set of images if you don't know what the MNIST digits data set is like. But there's information here. It's all about it. This came from some compressed source. And you can look at all of these other ones, and you can access them in turn. You can also use this GUI to, oops, not that one, to load new data sets. So I'm suggesting to myself here that I might want to go to, this doesn't fit on my screen quite as well as when I don't have it this large. So I can go to the, I can load one of these catalogs. So this is just a local file, and it appears in here. And we have a whole load of new things. So you need to know that you want to do this, but the GUI is useful like this. You can see for the first time that these catalogs are hierarchical. So a catalog can include references to other catalogs. If I click on this, I get a new entry over here. This is a self-reference, as it happens, just to point out that you can do that. So catalog and catalog one are catalog one and catalog one.nested are happen to be the same thing, which is an interesting thing to want to do. And you can load also from remote.
This would be really, really powerful in an enterprise setting, right? If there are families of catalogs available, and you could just say, open the GUI and have it loading up a
Exactly so. Or you can just point to a remote one. So in this particular case, this is the same catalog that I mentioned the Pangeo group was using, and it lives in this GitHub location, or it could be on S3 or in a number of places. That means that if I want to access one of these things, then whoever controls the catalog can just update it in place, and I don't need to know that. I just go to the catalog and I load it, and it's going to give me the current version of what I need. And that's the end of the demo.
I really appreciate that GUI. That looks very, very handy to use in a lot of situations.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Thank you for that demo, Martin.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, here I can close that. And then, so now we get to the meat of the episode, and in part of what you were hoping for out of the episode, to let people know about some of the ideas that you have for the future, and put out that call for requests, right? The call for questions, or what ideas do the users out there have for ways that Intake could make their data ingestion and data consumption easier. First, broadly speaking, Martin, where is the project going?
So we want this to be the de facto tool for people to access their data through. Obviously, that's what it wants to be, this place where all these different ideas can come together under a single roof, so that it can take away this pain of how do data definitions, data sets make their way through the system from whoever gets to say that, yes, this can be a data set that enters your corporate system, to the user that's actually going to use it. Or more simply, people can now publish their data as Condor packages or just as raw catalog files somewhere and say, hey, look at this data. I want you to use this too. And then other people can use that data without needing to go through all the painful steps that currently stand in between that.
Fantastic. So we're going to go ahead and discuss some of the items that you had listed that might you might pursue in the future. And we want to encourage the folks that are watching right now that are live to go ahead and make their opinions known too. If you've got some ideas, please share them in the chat and we'll be sure to mention them. One of the first items we have on the list is broadening the coverage of formats. Did you want to talk to that a little bit more, Martin?
Yeah, so there are lots of formats out there. It is true that a huge amount of data in the world is encoded in CSV, but in fact, CSVs are not the only thing, and even more than that, data frames are not the only thing. There's a huge amount of information that's available that doesn't get used because it's inconvenient, and filling those holes is one of the things that Intake can really do. It's easy to write a plugin for Intake so that other people can load a particular type of data. It's worth going to the Read the Docs website and looking at the set of, I'll put the link here in just a moment.
I went ahead and put it in
into the chat.
I added it for you.
So that's the roadmap.
Oh.
But there's also the plugin directory.
Awesome.
So that's the set of current things that you can install alongside Intake for various different formats. There's only a very small number that are built directly into Intake, and those are CSV, NumPy, text files. And all the others are these installable plugin things that provide drivers for things like Parquet, for example, or Avro, or a whole range of things that you can see in that list. Some of them you will notice are actually data services rather than file formats. So Intake is designed to be able to talk to other providers of data, whether that's something on which you can run a query or something that is itself a catalog service. So all of these things are possible, but it requires somebody with a knowledge of that particular service to come along and write the driver. We have a number. We would like to have a lot more, and we would like to have example data sets for all of them so that people can actually play with that type of data. That's really a main thrust of coming to a forum like this and talking to people.
That's fantastic.
It seems like y'all are covering a significant number of formats. And I think everybody in the PyData community is, as a data scientist, is concerned. Does this connect to Apache or integrate with Apache Spark?
At the moment, it does not have any explicit connection with Spark, but it's something that we hear about. And it's definitely something that we would like to make happen in both directions, which is use Intake to call Spark and have Spark load data. That's a pretty important use case, and that's fairly doable. And the opposite, which is getting data out of Spark and getting data into Spark, are the two sides of this, if you see what I mean. So if I want to load something locally in something that Python understands, and then I want to send that data to Spark somehow and have Spark understand that as a native data set, that's a harder problem. And something we want to do, and I personally don't yet know how, but presumably it can be done.
Good luck.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
One of the things I saw on the roadmap was the mention of derived data sets. I wondered if you could describe that a little bit more, and or describe it for us, and talk about where that fits into the roadmap.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we merged a PR 2 weeks ago, which is the very first derived data set, and it is called Alias. And basically, it is one of your data sets, but with a different name. Now, that might not sound very exciting, but it is just an alias. That's why it's called that. And the reason that it might exist is if you want to have several data sets with particular names within a particular category, but have your user only reference one of them, and then give the user a parameter to choose, and that parameter is going to pick between the different data sets. So at runtime, you decide which of those data sets to actually load. That's what Alias does, but it demonstrates this idea of derived data set, which is we're going to call one of the other data sets that we have defined and then do something to it. What that something is arbitrary. It's something that you have encoded into your class, into your driver. It's not arbitrary code execution. We're not going to build a free-flowing pipeline like this. But let's say you have a particular data type, which is you have images in 3 separate bands, and you want to make a composite color image of them. But you don't have a single loader that does that. But you do have a loader that loads the individual ones. So you could have a catalog that loads the 3, and there are 3 data sets there. And then you have a derived one, which takes those 3 as input and produces an output color composite. That kind of thing is doable now. And there'll be lots of interesting cases like that, where you know the type of data that's going to be your input, and you want to process it in a set way every time to produce a particular output. That's the idea. And again, suggestions on what you would actually want to implement in that, very welcome.
That sounds really, really intriguing. I can see why soliciting some input on that would be really, really valuable, just to kind of narrow in on the cases that are the most interesting and important to the broader community. We have received a few questions during the course of the webinar. The first question that came up was from Jared Thompson, and says, would a scenario of this in an enterprise be a company has lots of databases and Teradata or Hadoop? For intake to be useful, one would want to have some curated data sets that would be exported to a set of files that are refreshed at some interval and stored somewhere, then build catalogs off of those. I think that, so let me see if I can summarize.
I think I understand.
Okay.
The question is it a reasonable workflow to have data pulled from various data sources and materialized into files and then build a catalog that points to those? And the answer is yes, that's totally a reasonable thing that you might want to do. But in fact, you can build a driver that will directly talk to these data services themselves and reflect the data sources that they already expose. That's a different workflow. Both of those are independently useful.
Now, looking at it, that also seems like a good illustration of the notion of derived data set, right? Where you may want both and make it so that after you've done some work to choose slices through the data, to publish them and make them available within your organization.
Yeah, so at the moment, Intake has a concept of caching, which is to download files to local, where local is usually your particular machine. But if you're running this through a server, then it could be to wherever the server lives. And then it will use the locally cached version after you've downloaded it. The plan there is to have it expire after a certain amount of time, so it will refresh for you. At the moment, that's not yet implemented, but it should be implemented. And then a further follow-on would be to cache not just specific files, but the actual output of a query. At the moment, the caching just, if it's a downloadable thing, then it will download it. That's not quite the case for a data service where you're executing a query. But those things are definitely relatively short-term things that we'll implement.
Travis asks, how hard is it to add a new kind of container to the Intake universe? You know, like Xray, DataFrame, NumPy, DAS, PySpark, or other future container concepts?
So I'd invite people to look at the code, and I claim that it's not complicated. Obviously, I know the code base better than most people at this point, but looking at the number of lines of code that it takes to make that work, it's not much. And the same is true for any of these pluggable elements. So the internal containers it's a plugin system, just like the drivers is a plugin system, just like the server auth is a plugin system, and they're meant to be approachable so that people can write their own, definitely.
That's wonderful. I hope you'll get feedback soon on how easy it is, because I know how it's tough when you see the picture so clearly, and you hope everyone else can see it clearly. You just need everyone to take a peek to say if it's true or not.
To be sure, I don't think there's a documentation page on how to do that. I expect people to raise issues saying this container ought to exist first and then have a conversation about it, probably. There is specific documentation on how to build a driver, so something that loads into one of the existing containers. That I imagine is a more common thing that people want to do.
Well, Martin, I'm really thankful that we've gotten to have this discussion. I'm really excited for the potential of intake. And looking at all of the extensions and plugins that y'all have already, it's really exciting to see the potential value of people intaking their data. My question, kind of along the lines of the roadmap discussion, is how are y'all managing the growth or addition of new plugins? If somebody wanted to come along and actually create a new plugin for y'all, where would that live? And what are some of the development guidelines that somebody would have to take to get a new plugin into intake?
The easiest thing to do would be to go to one of the repos on the link that I posted in the chat here, the plugins directory. Go to any of those and copy it. And then you already have most of the framework in place for doing all the things that you need to do. These packages don't need to live within the intake repository. They can be their own independent thing, and that means that developers can choose their own cadence, their own release procedure. You can upload it to anaconda.org as you wish. So long as it depends on intake, it will work. Intake itself scans all of your packages at import time for something that's called intake-something. And if it finds a plugin in the top level, it will know about it. Or when you write an actual catalog that uses one of these things, you can refer to the fully qualified class name, so package.module.classname, and it will get loaded in that case when you actually try and use that particular data set.
Thank you.
We have another question from Travis. Do you have any examples of companies or communities using intake to create catalogs for their own use?
So the best one was the one that I used in the demo, which was the Pangeo. So that was on a particular URL. They also have a website. Let's see if I can, here it is. So they have a website which is rendered. Let me just drop this in here. So this is rendered from their catalog, which is an interesting thing to want to do. And it's the same set of data sets which I showed in the GUI earlier. And it shows you quite a bit of flexibility here, that you can take that spec, and because the spec itself in the YAML file is really simple, you can generate a view like this of it so that people will look at this instead of directly accessing the catalog. Maybe it's another option.
So you're telling me that I can just copy and paste these 3 lines of code and I'll have these data sets with intake installed?
Yes, except it depends on intake Xray, which it doesn't actually mention here, I notice.
Okay. All right. No, this is promising, though. Thank you.
Yeah, there are always subtleties that probably should be specified in the metadata of the catalog itself. So, for example, you'll see that most of these are ZAR datasets. ZAR works very well with the remote data, which all of this is. All of this data, I believe, lives on Google Cloud. Some of them are NetCDF, though. And NetCDF files will not load unless you do some special stuff, because it doesn't support remote. So there are always a few subtleties involved, and those descriptions on any extra steps that you need to do should be in the catalog itself.
So,
but in general, yes. In general, this is the kind of thing that you would just say, the second one, Newman's are this 3 lines. You can copy it. You can put it into a notebook and run it. And on first instance, it will say, cannot find Xray plugin or ZAR plugin. And you should know then that you need to install that. And once you have it, it would just access the data directly. all of this data is very large, by the way. It's designed for in-cloud processing, so I don't recommend you to try and actually download any of it. But the Pangeo people who have a cloud deployment with many Dask workers regularly work with this stuff.
So what's the minimum thing that I need to add data to a catalog?
You need a text editor.
Okay.
Yeah, you can just do it like that. The workflow that's described, so one of the examples is for the catalog author. So there's an examples page also in the documentation, and one of the examples there, which is also a binder notebook, is for the author of the catalog. And if you know a lot about your data, you might just type it out in YAML syntax, which is pretty forgiving syntax. But you can also use their intake.open, and there's a load of functions, and those functions will be populated from all of your currently installed plugins. So intake open underscore CSV is one that's always there. And you can play with those and figure out what set of parameters actually gets the data set in the way that you want. Having done that, you can do .to YAML, and it will produce that block, or at least it'll produce the bare version of that block that you would need to load the data. Then it's up to you to actually describe what it is that you're loading. So you still need to do that.
Thank you.
In a past life, I was an Eclipse developer. So one of the things that I find really exciting and intriguing about this project is its potential for use in Jupyter Labs. Is there any work that's kind of pending or nascent in thought to produce Jupyter Lab tooling for this?
We definitely want to do that. It's something that we've talked about. The current GUI that exists, which is based on Jupyter widgets, or IPy widgets as it was known, was really easy to get off the ground. That's why it came first. I found working with it to be quite a joy because I'm a Qt developer of old, and I would have made a desktop application to do this some years ago, but nobody seems to do that anymore. And I found that the Jupyter widgets experience was similar enough that I could get up and going. The Jupyter Lab experience is somewhat more involved. You have to actually get into the JavaScript or TypeScript side of it to be able to make that pane appear. I'm not TypeScript type. I don't really know what I'm doing there. Maybe somebody can help me. That would be really nice. In the meantime, however, the PyVis people, so the people behind HV HoloViews, HVplot, Bokeh, that team, they have a project called Panel that you might have heard of, which is pretty new and works both within a notebook and as a standalone application. So standing up that application within a pane in Jupyter Lab is maybe a shortcut that could work. I hope we can get together some effort to take that off the ground. Of course, all of these things can exist together. There's no need for there to be just one way to do this.
Well, Martin, thank you so much. This has been really, really wonderful. And Internet, you heard it here first. We need help building some UI on top of Intake, as well as contributing ideas and maybe even plugins to Intake.
Let me put the install line into the chat. I think that's quite important. Yeah. For the time being, all of the Intake packages live on the Intakes.
Yeah, so and there's a few more days.
We'll change with time. We'll put it, or it just hasn't happened yet.
There's a few more days left in Hacktoberfest, so maybe somebody can make Intake one of their contributions.
That'd be amazing. Oh, this is the portion of our webinar where we take a moment to stand up on our soapbox and give our world-famous rants. So each of us gets 1 minute or 15 seconds to rant about any topic we want. And first, Martin, why don't you go ahead?
I didn't think I was going to be first. 15 seconds might be pushing it, and this is not very techie, but it's something I think about a lot, which is that traffic is the bane of most people's lives. And it's an interesting sociological game theory thing in that every single person, like Toronto has transit, you can get everywhere that you want to. I realize that's not always the case. people think to themselves, if I go by bus, it's going to take me a certain amount of time longer than it does if I go by car. That's how things work. And so most people don't go by bus. That means that there's now loads and loads and loads of cars on the street, and that means that it's slower for everybody. So by each individual person taking this choice that seems to be the optimal choice for them, we end up in a situation that's suboptimal for everybody. If most people went by bus, if the vast majority of people went by bus, and therefore we could have lots more buses, then actually everybody would get around much faster. And I don't know how to get at the root how you solve this situation.
It reminds me of the study that the fastest way to get people on an airplane is random. But like just a random distribution of people. But the problem with that is that people want to feel like they're getting ahead, and so we end up with our suboptimal boarding patterns. Tony, what's your rant for today?
I mean, I'm not one to complain, but I'm actually most excited about the announcement of a Jupiter Day Triangle. So on November 13th, at Raleigh Triangle at UNC Chapel Hills Library, there's an all-day Jupiter event. It's super cool to see events in the Southeast. We don't get them so much. And personally, I'm most excited about the ITK Jupiter Widgets talk, which is interactive 3D and 2D image visualization for Jupiter. And that one's by Matt McCormick. So hopefully I get to meet some folks and see some people at a Jupiter Day Triangle on November 13th.
Are you aware of IPy Volume?
Yeah.
That's a great library, especially if you use it for cataplots.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
No. What are oh?
You should look that up.
That was a
cataplot is
data joke, right?
Yeah, a cataplot is a scatterplot where all of your markers are cats.
That's awesome. I like it. Let's see.
Sorry for hijacking.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I yet again came unprepared with a rant, but I was driving out here this morning, and there are still sections of North Carolina that are not covered by LTE. And so, I just want to say, I just wish LTE was everywhere. That's not so much of a rant, but, I really am kind of addicted to the internet. And it's frustrating when iTunes cuts out just because, you're in the middle of nowhere. What's up with that? Well, that's about all we have for today. I want to thank everybody for joining us, especially Martin. Thank you so much for taking the time out to show us intake and share the future direction of the project with us. Really appreciate it. And Tony, thank you for joining me today as well. It was fun co-hosting with you. And it was kind of fun being Anthony for the day. I look forward to Anthony's return in our next webinar, though. And thank everybody for joining us.
Take care. Thank you all.
Bye.